On September 25th of 2023, this year, Diane Downs wrote a letter to the Parole Board requesting a new hearing. Okay. Now, in these letters, it is very telling because, she's really making the argument about how she is not a danger. She doesn't have a specific diagnosis that she was given. We'll look into that. Let's start by reviewing this parole board hearing from like 12 years ago. It is up on YouTube, which is awesome for us. And then we'll review some of the letters that she wrote. And if you missed the last video, I'll link it in the description box so you guys can watch it. Y'all let me know your thoughts.
You still maintain that you did not commit these murders? Or the murder and the other crimes you were convicted of?
Absolutely. I didn't commit them, and I still maintain my innocence.
The night you took your children to the hospital in Springfield, will you describe the events of that evening?
Yes. My kids and I were sitting at home watching TV. We were watching Helen Keller, the Helen Keller story. I received a phone call from someone who said that he wanted me to come pick up some photographs for my boyfriend, not of my boyfriend, but for my boyfriend, Rick. Rick is a guy that I'd been dating for about 6 weeks, and he claimed to be an FBI agent. Whether or not he was, I don't know. I certainly never called him at work or showed up or made him prove it or show a badge. It didn't matter to me. To me, it was just dating. But I received a phone call about 9:15 from someone who said I needed to come pick some photographs up for Rick. I piled the kids in the car. We went out to go meet this person to pick up the photographs. I stopped by Heather. Wow, I can't remember Heather's last name now. I stopped by Heather's house because I told Heather on the phone a few days earlier that I had a newspaper.
And please note, the story has changed a couple times. So this other boyfriend pictures or picking up material for the boyfriend. I mean, it's just changed. It really has. I think the biggest thing is to notice Diane Downs is very disconnected. So it is very easy for her to rehearse and retell this situation from maybe in different ways because of her disconnection. She's disconnected from the pain that she has caused others, and how her actions have impacted others. And so I think that her ability, even seeing this now from when we saw the interview from the 80s, seeing this to 12 years ago, being this raw footage, what can we really say about people that are sociopaths? They don't change.
Ad for her. So
There's like
she had been wanting to buy a horse, and this was a newspaper ad that would allow her to adopt a horse. So I had told her that I had a newspaper clipping for her that I'd found at work. So as long as we were going out to meet this guy to pick up photographs, we went by Heather's house. Heather said, I already got a horse just the other day. So we went to see the horse. We got back in the car. We left. I went to meet this guy. Somebody in the road flagged us down. I stopped and got out of my car, and he said something to the effect of, I want your car. And I laughed at him. And I said, you've got to be kidding. Because in my mind, those kinds of things don't happen. In Arizona, those things don't happen. I don't know about Oregon, but in Arizona, those things don't happen. And so he jumped into the car, leaned into the car, and started firing the weapon. And it happened so quickly that by the time he stood up and faced me, it was over. I mean, it was just that fast. He said something about the car again, and I struggled with him. The gun discharged. He fell back. I jumped in the car, put the keys in the ignition, and took off. The car door shut by itself. That's it. And I went to the hospital. Christy and Danny were in the back seat. When we got to the hospital, they were still crying. The nurses reported that they were still crying. The states.
You guys remember when she was talking about the details of one child choking in her blood and the crying, and the yelling and making sure that they, trying to keep them alive. That y'all remember that? She's skipping over this now, right? Because those details are very, they were very much like, wow, she really told it, right? She really told these certain details that were very gory. And she herself said so many years ago that she doesn't suppress memories. She don't suppress memories. No, 'cause she wanted to remember. And her biggest concern when she got to the hospital was the blood type, talking to the police, making sure that they found them and getting everything situated, right? That's what her concern was.
I don't know. A lot of people, when something traumatic happens to them, they suppress it immediately. I kept those memories because I knew that I was the only person that was going to be able to tell them what happened when we got to the hospital. And when I got there, the first thing I said was call the doctors. Second thing was the blood type. Third thing was call the cops because they've got to find him. And so I had to remember as much as I could remember.
In Diane's own words, she chose not to suppress what was going on when her kids were shot. Okay. Here, this is 12 years ago, so it's interesting how those details don't play in here no more, right? Why is that? I don't know. I mean, let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments.
Says that I was the one that shot them and that I wanted them dead. If that was the case, I would not have taken to the hospital still crying. There are so many other ways to accomplish such a horrific deed if I was going to do it. I'm certainly bright enough to figure out another way besides some way that looks so absolutely insane and hokey that nobody would believe it.
So Diane Downs' thought process in this argument is like, okay, if I wanted to kill my kids, there would be other ways to do it instead of doing it this way. I wouldn't have driven my kids to the hospital. Her thought is, making the argument of I would have made sure that they were dead, right? Such an impulsive thing to have done. She feels like, there was no, if I can make the argument of no premeditation, then that clearly means that I'm innocent. No, it doesn't. That's just my thought. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
I'm not dumb.
She's not.
Ultimately, you told several different versions of the story when law enforcement investigated this, correct?
She did.
When you talked
Not
to
correct.
audience, ultimately, well, I understood that you told law enforcement that this was done by two men with ski masks.
Remember, there was the story of the two men. She did say that to a reporter. A reporter tried asking her that back in the 80s, like, what's up with, the two men in the ski mask, and then she just tried to kind of like brush that off. She puts that on somebody else, like the prosecution or the media or something. It's never what she's put out there, but she did put out different stories about what happened that night.
This is what somebody told me. How do I explain this?
You can't.
After my children and I were attacked, the police kept saying, Diane, you must have lapses in your memory because there's holes in this you could drive a semi truck through. None of this makes sense. You're forgetting something. I believed, because I'd never had any dealings with authorities, and I believed the authorities, and so I thought they did, that I had lapses of memory. I can't tell you how the towel got around my arm, so I know from my own personal experience that I did have at least that much of a lapse of memory. I don't know how the towel got around my arm.
How it was wrapped perfectly in her arm. Keep that in mind.
So when I would have, what people would call me up and people would say, I know so-and-so and he said such and such. I have another guy would call and say, I have a neighbor and he has a car that just looks just like that and he's been talking. These kinds of things were being said to me either by phone. People would stop me on my mail route. I worked in Cottage Grove and people would drive all the way to Cottage Grove just to meet me on my mail route and tell me these kinds of things. So I would call the police, or I would go to the police and I would say, this is what's being told to me. those are the kinds of things they would say that I changed my story. I wasn't changing my story. I was trying to help. The police kept saying I had lapses of memory. People were calling me and telling me things that I thought, well, maybe this is what happened that I don't know. And so I would tell the police, believing that I was helping them investigate. They didn't tell anybody that these are reports, that I was giving them reports from other people. They would simply say, Diane came in and said such and such. The one about the ski mask was dreams that I was having. And they kept saying, well, maybe you forgot something. So when I would have a dream and I would wake up, I would think, well, maybe that's what I would forget.
So now so this was just dreams and lapses in her memories and all kinds of stuff. What do you guys think? If we were to play some of the Oprah stuff back when she was sitting there with Ann Rule, and Ann Rule and her were going back, because Ann Rule and her went back and forth when the Small Sacrifices book was written. And there were so many things that she gave back then that now she's not able to give it. I mean, she's forgotten her lies, okay? Her memory is lapse in the lies that she told, okay? Right? That's really what happened.
And so the ski mask story, I didn't tell the police. I was talking to somebody on the phone, and I was I was sharing this dream, this thought with somebody, trying to understand in the same way that you would talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so that you can, because if you talk, maybe you can reach something, maybe you can find something that's inside you that's locked off. And so I was sharing this with somebody else, and the police were tape recording those phone calls and then said, oh, there she goes. She changed her story. And that wasn't it. And they know that wasn't it.
Okay, well, ma'am, I guess perhaps you could clarify it for me, because as you said, I am the newest person here and I'm asking you new questions. But when I'm reading the pre-sentence investigation, it says subsequently defendant gave a total of 3 different versions of the shooting, including that it was done by 2 men wearing ski masks, and also that she knew the person shot them. Did you not give 3 different versions of the story?
The police said strangers don't shoot strangers for no reason. So I believe this had to be somebody who knew me. They also, at one point, the last day that I got to see Christy in the hospital, I believe it was June 15th.
She still does not answer the question. The parole board is asking, did you or did you not give different versions of the story? It's a yes or a no. Yes, I did, because I believed X, Y, and Z. Yes, I did, because I truly believe that these men with ski masks attacked me and my children. Yes, I did give 3 different versions, because I felt like I didn't do this, therefore I'm trying to, figure a different solution to this. She never really admits to the fact that she gives different accounts. And in all the interviews that you watch with Diane Downs, she never answers a yes and no question. Like, she never gives a yes or no answer to a question that's a very direct question. Because that would require for her to actually be honest with what has actually happened, right?
Of 83, Doug Welch came to the hospital and said, Steve Downs did this. We know Steve Downs did this. You need to be willing to testify against him. I said, how do you know Steve Downs, my ex-husband? How do you know Steve Downs did this? Give me the evidence. He said, don't worry about the evidence. Just be willing to testify. I said, if you can't prove to me he did it, he's not the one that fired the gun. He said, but he was behind it. I said, I cannot testify against somebody unless you can prove to me that he did this. I know he hates me, but why would he hurt the kids? Doug Welch said,
His kids, by the way, these were biological children of his, other than the youngest one that he questioned paternity to.
you better be willing to play ball or you'll never see your kids again. And I said, I cannot testify against somebody unless you can prove to me that he did it. The next day when I went to see my children, I was not allowed to see my children ever again. That gave me the belief that the police were absolutely convinced that somebody I knew did this. And if the police believed it, then I believed it.
So because she wasn't allowed to see her kids anymore, that convinced her that somebody that she knew did this. And if the police believed it, even though there's no direct statement from the police, okay, the parole board has all the paperwork, right? They have the paperwork to figure out exactly like who said what and what on and everything that went down. But according to her, that was enough for her to know. By the way, I am drinking some coffee. What are you drinking? Put it in the chat.
Now, if they want to turn this all around and say Diane changed her story, that's not what happened. And you guys are on the parole board, and I know you work with the legal authorities. You work with police, you work with the district attorneys, and so you know how they work. It's how they, I know now what they were trying to do. They were trying to scoop me into a corner so that I don't know, so that I would say or do something that would incriminate me, which certainly worked. But that's not what happened. Though what I'm telling you is exactly what happened. Doug Welch came to the the hospital in Springfield. Oh, I can't even think. Mackenzie Willamette. No, anyway, to the Springfield hospital. He sat right there. He caught me when I was coming through the front door. He pulled me into the lobby. And these are the things he said to me. I went to see Christy for 15 minutes because that's all I was allowed. I left and he was standing there and he goes, "I'm not playing, Diane." And I said, "Prove to me Steve did this." He says, "Let us worry about the proof." And I said, "I can't testify against him unless you can prove to me he did this." And I left. The next day, I did not see my children ever again until court. And that was it. And so I believed what I thought the police believed. Now, maybe they did believe that. Maybe to this day, they still believe it, because Fred Hugie was another time he told my attorney, Jim Jagger said, "Fred, you know Diane is innocent."
You know what the crazy part is that, and I feel for the board because they asked her a question and I forgot what the hell they asked her because she just talks and talks and talks and talks. It doesn't answer the question. So, like, I would imagine that this would be a very difficult thing to sit through. And then imagine having to transcribe and, report everything out. Can you imagine?
He said, "I know that and you know that, but she's covering for somebody. And as long as she's going to cover for somebody, she's going to do that person's time." Jim Jagger said, go ahead.
I said, so is it your,
Jim,
is it what you're saying today is that the prosecutor in your case knew you were innocent, yet in order to get someone else, to convict someone else for this, he basically threatened to keep your kids from you in order to get you to make incriminating testimony against somebody else? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Jim Jagger told me Fred
She's not saying that.
Hugie said this to him. I don't know that Fred Hugie said this. I have no reason to believe Fred Hugie said this now. But that's what Jim Jagger told me Fred Hugie said. So from that point on, I believed, from that point on, I believed that Fred Hugie believed that it was somebody that I knew. That's what I'm telling you. That is what shaped my belief patterns. And so when I would talk to the police, I spoke to the police as if it was somebody that was familiar to me. Not because I believed they were familiar to me, but because Fred Hugie told Jim Jagger, and Jim Jagger told me that Fred Hugie told him this. I have no reason to believe Fred Hugie would do that. I don't. Fred Hugie adopted my children.
Fred Hugie, by the way, was the prosecutor. He did adopt the children. And people have said whether because he prosecuted the mother, in the case, whether there would have been a conflict of interest, like how that wasn't a conflict of interest. I am kind of curious to know about that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm really happy that these children, who are now adults, they're actually older than me. Shout out to them. That I would imagine the years of therapy, we don't even know what that looks like for them now. that this would have required, right? To have your own mother shoot you, okay, and then kill your sibling in front of you, and then deny, no apology, and continues to do so, no remorse whatsoever. Some of you guys were pointing out in the comments how you'll never forget the song from Duran Duran, "Hungry Like a Wolf," because that was the song that Diane Downs was playing when she shot her children. The prosecution actually played it in court, and that actually was also reenacted in the movie Small Sacrifices. This woman, her children are transactional. Her trying to trap a man by having a baby, and also the disconnection of what motherhood is, right? Or at least what a lot of us think it should be. Um, that you have a kid and that there should be this solid connection. And there are people out there. Um, I've had friends and family members that struggle with postpartum, that will say, I struggle with connecting with my kiddo, especially when they're a newborn. And that's completely understandable and treatable, right? There's help for things like that. But this woman was beyond that. These babies were not newborn babies, but she saw her kids as a transaction. She saw her kids as a thing that you just have, and that you could keep having if you miss them, right? As she has used her own words to say that. No connection. There was never a connection, I don't think. She is by far probably one of the worst mothers that we know of. There's a lot others, but she is one of them. For those kids who are now adults, a lot older than me actually, um, probably had to have years of therapy and coming to terms with that. And not only that, if the prosecutor adopted them, imagine what the therapy that they had to do together. Because the prosecutor didn't just close the case and say, all right, I'm done. No, there was probably years of family therapy or some type of therapeutic services in that household for them to move on. People in the chat said that they felt like that was a conflict of interest. Maybe, but we don't know how that was mitigated. We don't know what that looked like. Did he stop practicing in that case after the prosecution? Probably. Did he adopt him after she was already prosecuted? Would that then be a conflict after he stopped prosecuting that case? You let me know your thoughts in the comments.
During the trial, can I go ahead and jump ahead with this?
Sure.
Okay.
She doesn't
During
answer
the
the question.
trial, at the very end of the trial, Fred Hugie, they brought in a mock-up of the car, and Fred
They
Hugie
did.
got a gun, and he was reenacting the crime. And when he was going through the motions of firing the gun at the Christy doll and at the Cheryl doll and at the Danny doll, he couldn't shoot the Danny doll because the Danny doll was back here. And he raised up and he looked at me and I went like this. And his face, he had a look of incredulation on his face and his mouth started to open and I nodded my head yes. And he had to switch the gun to the left hand. A right-handed person could not have shot the Danny doll. It was at that time. I don't think at any time before that did Fred Hugie believe that he was doing anything wrong. I think that he believed full bore that what he was doing was the right thing. But, and I'm not inside Fred Hugie's head, I don't have the right to speak for him and I won't speak for him. But it was after that he adopted my children and according to Christy, never said a bad word against me.
It's probably a good thing. Probably, I mean, that's a good thing. He never said anything against her. Now, a lot of people have believed that Diane Downs was innocent because there was no gun residue. This also being a defense of like which side did she shoot. But if you see the reenactment of the movie, which is as close as you can get to what the trial was like, it had said that she had moved from one side to from the back seat to the driver's seat to shoot her children. Um, we saw a little bit of that on the last upload. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
We asked Diane if she'd do a reenactment for us. We simply wanted to nail down her statements, and she was more than happy to do that.
Sitting in the car is Elizabeth Diane Downs.
She can be seen sitting in the car, and she's kind of primping, making sure that her hair looked the way she wanted it.
Diane Downs is trying to show the investigators exactly what happens.
I'm throwing the keys, okay? I'm throwing the keys.
So they can understand and get the forensics right.
I go like that. I got in the car, jumped in, put the keys in. I just hit my cast. Started the car and left. The car door shut itself.
She was giddy, she laughed, she cracked jokes. I mean, she's reenacting the gruesome shootings of her 3 children. She doesn't seem at all upset.
This is worse than, okay.
She'd hit her cast and made the statement, "This is worse than," and she caught herself. So we speculated, of course, what she would have said to finish that sentence, and we always thought, "This is worse than when I shot myself."
I can guarantee you that performance by Diane Downs made cops stand up at attention and take another look at her story.
Comments.
We went
Ever. That was out of Christy's mouth. Fred Hughey, in all the time that he raised her, never spoke ill of me. I believe that Fred Hughey knows that there is a man out there that was hunting my children. And it wasn't until after Christy told her schoolmates that she drew pictures in school and she said, "This is the man who shot us." I lied in court because they wanted me to say this and they wouldn't leave me alone. Dr. Peters, she said, Dr. Peterson kept pressuring me and he wouldn't leave me alone.
We don't know what this questioning looked like. I do kind of wonder if any video footage exists of that, of Christy having been pressured, of the children having been pressured to testify.
Those children, the Andresens, told their mother told her, the apartment manager, and the apartment manager told somebody. Now, he didn't tell my attorney until 1991, but he apparently told somebody before that. But it was at that time when Christy was in that school and classmates with the Andresen twins that Fred Hughey decided to adopt my children.
Now, this is the only time I've ever seen Diane Downs show any emotion when she talks about her parents. She got really worked up during this part of the parole hearing. Let's watch.
I'm going to need the security of living with my parents and knowing that there's somebody right there, or am I going to want the freedom emotionally to have my own place that I can call my own without having to worry about 7 roommates right there and vying for the sink and the toilet and the shower and everything else. They don't know. They are trying to cover all bases so that they're letting me know that I have the option of choosing for myself, that I can live alone or I can live with them, whatever makes me most comfortable.
Okay,
So yeah, we talked about that. Oh.
You had conversations about your needs, but have you thought about their needs? Because your case obviously has attracted some attention. How will it be for them
Yes.
with all the potential attention that you living with them might bring upon them? Have you thought about their needs in this?
Yes, every time I call home, I ask them, can we please move?
It is so interesting that I don't know if she's just very close to her parents, but her reaction here about her parents and their living situation really just surprised me. Like, this is the only time I've ever seen Diane Downs really cry. It wasn't for her children. It was for her parents' safety.
I want them to move to another place. When I used to file legal work back before I finally got my answers, and you check and see when my legal work all stopped. It's when I finally got the answers and I was finally able to calm down and just be me again, about 2005. But back in the day when my dad would file, I would write everything. My dad would type it. My mom would copy it and she would do the filing for all of my legal work. Well, my dad, on the filing page, that's the certificate of mailing, you have to sign your name. My dad would always put his address. So everybody knows where my parents live. And so every time I would talk to my parents on the phone, not every time, at least once a month, when I talked to my parents on the phone, I would say, please, can we move someplace else? I would like to live someplace else where nobody can find you, because people are going to be coming by the house all the time, wanting to peek in the windows, wanting to heaven knows what. And I don't want us to have to deal with heaven knows what. My dad's 80. He had a stroke 2 years ago. He's very thin. He's lost 30 pounds. He stumbles, he falls. My goodness gracious, when they were here in August, his whole arm was bruised. I was scared to death that my mom was going to be arrested for battery of an elder because
The thing that comes to her mind, that her mother would be arrested.
and I asked, what happened to you? My mom says he falls now. And I do not want my parents to have to worry about when my mom has to go out and get groceries because she can't get my dad to go in the car. It's easier for my dad to just stay at home. I don't want my mom to have to worry about when she has to go grocery shopping. Is somebody at the end of Quarter Mile Road going to be there throwing tomatoes at the car or wanting a signature, or can you sign my book or whatever? I don't want and so I would ask them, please just move. And it wasn't until May of this year when it was finally time. They know by ORS 144.228 that my parole date was May 9th. And so in April, my mom said, I've decided we're going to move and not tell the kids where we're going. I said, okay. But so my parents finally said yes, that they will move.
You know what is so interesting is that I'm watching her, talking about the situation with her parents, and there's this very like childlike demeanor about her. I can't really describe it, but like the way she talks about like, her parents telling her, well, we're telling you all your kids that we're moving. Now, I have parents, and I think no matter what I do, no matter how much I adult, no matter how many children I may have, how many children I may birth, or how much I do, I think I will always be treated like a child because in their eyes, that's what I am. Although I'm an adult, right? But it's almost like, there's a very childlike demeanor to her when she describes her parents. I love my parents, but the phase of acting like a child has left me years ago, right? So it's interesting how she talks about her parents. Maybe it's because they're the only people that have actually stayed in contact with her throughout the years. Could be. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
Unfortunately, for me to move, I have to tell you guys where I'm moving, and it's the same as telling the media where I'm moving, and telling the media is telling the wackos, because somehow the wackos always seem to know everything. And the only thing that I can ask is, please, if you do parole me and you allow us to transfer to another state, someplace, please don't tell anybody where we are. I mean, it's the only way that I can keep my parents safe. I'm not worried. Come on, I live with 4,000 of the worst people in humanity, and it's a washing machine. It keeps turning over and turning over. We in California, we parole 11,000 people a month, a year, and they come right back. So I'm not concerned about my safety, but my parents are old. If you think that it's better for me to parole someplace and never see my parents, again, and that's the only way to keep them safe, then I would do that. But I don't want to not see my parents again.
If you think that it would be better for me to parole somewhere else and never see my parents again, and look how she gets worked up. This is the only time I've ever seen Diane Downs actually cry. I didn't see her cry in the cameras when she was talking about her kids. No, I saw her smiling. That's interesting. Does she feel empathy for her parents? Are those the only people that get her this way? Her parents, not her own children?
I love my parents. My dad needs me to take care of him. He's 80 and he falls. He's a big man. My mom's a little woman. She doesn't, when it finally comes time to start bathing him and taking care of him, my mom isn't going to be able to do that by herself. Sending me someplace away from my parents would not be good for them. I could do it. I've certainly dealt with, I've lost my children. Once somebody takes your children from you, taking your parents is what's next. But my parents really need me.
She really believes that she did not commit this crime. Right? Once somebody takes your children from you, what? You took your children from you, your child, your other two.
And so if you're going to parole me someplace to hide me, like you did Janice, well, like the others did Janice Freeman, that's great. But hide my parents too, please. It was back in 85. I saw the eyebrow. It was back in 85. Janice Freeman, when they paroled her, they didn't tell the media where she was. And if you're going to do that for me, do it for my parents. Don't do it for me. Do it for my parents, because they do not need the kookaloos. And I know, there you go. There's some insight. This.
Do you guys think, side note, just a question, and let me know in the chat, but do you guys feel like she should be given some level of privacy given the high coverage that this case got back in the 80s? Do you guys feel like she should be awarded some privacy? Let me know, because let me tell you something. I mean, the 80s was a crazy time, right, when it came to the media and the coverage. But now, in 2023, when you got YouTubers and bloggers and vloggers and TikTokers and IG people, and even the media itself, I mean, it's expanded in different ways in which it practices. Do you feel like she needs to be awarded some level of privacy? Let me know your thoughts.
This is what insight has done, because I know what kookaloos. I live with kookaloos every day. I've become inured to it. You don't ever get used to kookaloos, but you learn how to survive them.
What the hell is a kookaloo? Does she just mean like crazy people? I've never heard of the term kookaloo. Is that like a thing? Don't come for me. Just let me know in the chat. What the hell is a kookaloo?
My parents don't know how. My parents don't. My mom will do the same thing that I did back in 83. She'll get a phone call and she'll go out to meet somebody. My parents, please don't parole me away from my parents. They need me. They as much as you think I'm a danger to them simply because of the kookaloo factor, if the kookaloos can't find me, they'll go to my parents. They will. They will. They'll do whatever it takes, because I know what they do in here.
Ms. Downs, I'm pleased to hear that you've been able to keep your relationship up with your parents. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, she's just getting some tissue. Oh, I didn't think I was going to need these this time. Thank you.
Okay. Take your time.
She really broke down.
Okay.
What you've been able to maintain parents. Any other relationships that you've been able to maintain that you'd like to share with that might help you if you release in the community? Are you involved in a romantic relationship at all? Any friendships or anything?
No, none that take me there. None that I would need. No.
I wonder if she has maintained like a pen pal or something. Like, I wonder if anybody has ever written to her out of curiosity or out of fascination, because people tend to do that sometimes. There was an interview that Diane Downs' brother did with a reporter that also reported on the case back when in the 80s. And I wanted to add this to this video as well because, giving full story from the brother's side, why the brother and this reporter feel like Diane Downs is innocent. Okay? Let me know your thoughts in the comments as we're reviewing this.
I'm here with Eric Mason and James Frederickson. Eric is a reporter turned private investigator who covered the Diane Downs case 30 years ago. A shooting happened that involved her children. James Frederickson, Diane Downs' brother. James is looking for information at this point. There are questions about the conviction. Eric, you were there. Can you start by explaining what your memories are about the Diane Downs case that you covered, and the fact that your timing as a reporter was very much in line with this case?
Well, I was just a brand new recruit there at the NBC station. I had just finished University of Oregon School of Journalism and came to work there. We had put KMTR on the air in those first 2 weeks. Some of the newscasts were without sound. And so we were this fledgling news operation, and certainly it was the biggest story in town. It was the biggest story in the state. It became national. And, for all of us, it was this huge opportunity because here was a gigantic story in our backyard.
Absolutely gigantic. James, let's go right back to the beginning. I mean, what a shock it must have been for you to hear this. Can you tell me how the information initially came to you?
So I was on my house in Lodi, California, and the phone rings like at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it's my dad on the other end. And he says, your sister and family have been attacked. And your niece, Cheryl, is dead. It was just surreal.
I don't imagine, that you even ever completely recover from news like that.
Yeah.
My understanding is that Diane and her brother were not very close. So I'm not sure if this crime led them to be closer, but yeah, he definitely looks like his sister.
So here you are 30 years later, and you have questions about a lot of different components of this case.
Absolutely.
And in a general sense, you keep learning more.
Every day that I read on this, I mean, it's, I mean, she never held a gun.
Let's talk about that for a moment. Ballistics in court demonstrate that when a person fires a gun, there's blowback, it covers their hands. This didn't exist.
No. Actually, the night of the shooting, they put this liquid to check to see if she held a gun, fired a gun, and it was dripping off her hands. We did it at 2 in the morning, I believe is what it was. And she never held a gun. She had never fired a gun. Didn't have any blood spatter on her, no gunpowder, residue, nothing.
Eric?
So the night of the shooting, you know, when they put this liquid on her, this is what he's saying, and she never held a gun. She never shot a gun, if I'm hearing that correctly. When I heard this, it made me look into this a little bit more. Matter of fact, I Google searched it. This is what I asked. What evidence convicted Diane Downs? And the first thing that came up was from case law. And it said, ballistic experts testified that bullets taken from Downs' home had extractor marks identical to cartridge casings found at the crime scene. The marks were from a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic pistol, the same make of a firearm which Downs had possessed and used previously. The gun was never found, by the way. So when I clicked on that, it took me to an area where the case law is quoted as factual and procedural background. Petitioner Diane Downs was convicted of murder, attempted murder, and assault in the Lane County Circuit Court in Oregon in 1984. The jury found that she fatally shot one of her children, Sherilyn, then age 7, and seriously wounded the other 2, Christy and Danny, then ages 8 and 3. Christy testified at trial that she saw her mother open the trunk of her car and then shoot each of the 3 children. So that was one piece of testimony that convicted her. Ballistics experts testified that bullets taken from Downs' home had extractor marks identical to cartridge casings found at the crime scene. The marks were from a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic pistol, the same make of a firearm which Downs had possessed and used previously. The gun was last seen in her possession in 1983. The murder weapon was never recovered. Okay, so then you have the different testimonies that Diane Downs gave. So when brother says she didn't have any residue, no gunpowder or whatever, how often is gunpowder left when somebody shoots it? Is that an automatic thing? Would somebody have time to wipe themselves off of it? How do you see it on you? So these are just kind of the forensic questions that I had when I heard him say that.
Eric, you covered the case almost in its entirety. You were sharing some thoughts earlier about, when you look back, and what's your impression of that experience in that case?
Well, a number of other reporters covered the actual night that it happened and the aftermath. So I came in later. I was working, by the time the trial happened, I was working for the CBS station in Portland and covering the trial every day. And so my experience is kind of through the lens of the trial and watching the defense work, watching the prosecution work, and really coming to some kind of conclusion that the defense that was mounted was not very aggressive. I mean, really, it was more along the lines of, here's Diane, here are the pictures of her life. How could this woman have done this crime? And they really didn't attack things in terms of alternate suspects.
When I read about the case, this was one thing that was the thing that Diane Downs didn't really have a good defense team at the time. And by the way, I did search whether if you can remove gunpowder residue from your hands. And it says that gunshot residue can be removed by action, such as washing hands, wiping clothes, or brushing it off. So the absence of residue does not prove that the person did not recently fire a gun.
The alternate suspects, going and looking at what later becomes a person of interest in the case, after the fact now. And so as a result, I think really the jury really, I think, was very well molded by the prosecution, who had, a very good narrative set up for Diane and the motives for why she would want to shoot those three children.
If all the information from the prosecution, if everything they had wasn't shared with the defense, as you were explaining earlier, 50 shades of gray, it's a very complex case. Would that not make it easier for either side to perhaps, throw information in that, I mean, it gets complicated. Can a jury really keep up with ballistics and this type of thing? I mean,
well, I think they can. I think a jury juries are, for the most part, fairly intelligent and follow the information. But when they're not given something in the alternative, that is that this could have been done by a biker gang, this could have, and to be able to develop an alternate theory of what happens, there doesn't seem to be really an alternative theory by the defense, except the shaggy-haired stranger did it. And that was kind of laughable. People heard that and just thought to themselves, that sounds like a story. And because there was no name or identity or fleshing out of this shaggy-haired stranger, it just seemed like a myth.
The argument that I'm hearing is that there wasn't a solid alternative theory to the defense of who could have done this, right? The bushy hair eyebrow guy or whatever, I take offense to that because I got some bushy eyebrows. But the bushy hair whatever guy didn't really fly. I don't know if an alternate theory is going to suffice if the jury is feeling like there's enough sufficient evidence to say that Diane Downs did this crime. The defense's job is to create reasonable doubt. So if they didn't do a good job of that, then I guess that's a different story, right?
At the time of the trial.
Right.
Stuck to the story though, didn't they?
Yeah.
And it is laughable. But what if it's truth?
And in reading about it over the years, I've always wondered, and from the standpoint of someone who does criminal defense now and post-conviction relief, that missed opportunities by the defense form what becomes ineffective assistance of counsel, that then becomes the potential for a new trial for somebody like Diane Downs.
Yeah, and he was quoted as saying actually that there was 300 pages withheld. He was quoted saying, if I'd had access to those, I could have put on a better defense.
And that's a good point in general for anyone facing trial. Any missed opportunities by the defense leaves opportunities for the prosecution to get on that ass, right? Pretty much.
I don't know what exactly his wording was.
This is Mr. Jagger.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about the fact that the oldest daughter of Diane Downs ultimately gave court testimony. But this child was also adopted by the district attorney. Was Fred Hughey the DA? Was he the actual DA or was he
was
the prosecutor? Okay, deputy DA. Have you ever heard of that happening before, where a convicted murderess has her children adopted by the person who's pressing the case against her?
I don't think that we've ever heard, at least I've never heard of that happening. But I've talked about this before. The question was, and I've asked this before, and I'll ask this, you guys tell me in the chat, is it a conflict of interest that the DA that prosecuted the case has adopted the children, the victims of the crime, right? So is it a conflict of interest for the DA? Like, it would be for the DA, right? If this was a different kind of crime, would it make a difference? If the kids did not die and Diane Downs had brutally abused these children, would the DA be okay, the DA prosecuting the case be okay in adopting these children? Who is the conflict of interest to and for? And is there one? he was permitted to adopt these kids, and I'm assuming still practice law. I don't know if he continued to sit, oversee the case after everything was said and done. Let me know your thoughts.
I haven't. And I think that was a question I think at the time that people were asking was, what is the objectivity level? What is the role of someone who's a prosecutor? And obviously he cared deeply for what had happened to those kids. And I knew a reporter who went down and spent some time with Fred and those kids and just got a portrait of what their life was like after it had happened. But certainly, I think if you do this work, you do have to step back a bit from it and be objective, even when you have a client who you're working on their case and you're trying to be an advocate. You really do have to deal with the facts and the truth, and everyone has to deal by the same set of facts. So to the extent that, it was heroic of him, yes. Is it something that we all sort of wondered about as journalists at the time? We wondered about it,
I really, it's like people call it heroic, because he was such a wonderful man that he would adopt these poor stricken children, that he would take them and he would look over the mask and see Christy and how she was such a helpless child that she needed somebody to just care for her and protect her from the big bad woman world. But it's like, did it ever really occur to anybody that the adoption didn't take place until 2 years after the sentencing?
So if the adoption didn't take place 2 years after the sentencing, why would that be a conflict of interest then? It wasn't like he prosecuted her, she went to jail, and then bam, she adopted these kids. I guess that's not what he did. He waited, which would make sense, I think, for an adoption process, because these kids would have to have worked through whatever trauma they went through, right? Here's my question. If it really bothered Diane's brother, was he even looked into for an adoption possibility or placement? Because my understanding is that these kids were taken into foster care right away. They weren't placed with family. So where was he at? If he was so concerned, why didn't he step up? Or did he, and did the agency feel like he's probably not a good match right now? Just a thought. Because otherwise, these kids would be in foster care, right? In foster homes. How is that any better? The father said he couldn't afford having all these kids by himself. He didn't fight the adoption.
Yeah, that's an unusual fact. As is the fact that her son, Danny, Diane's son, said the bad man. And can you talk about that, James?
Yeah, so there's the testimony of Danny wasn't allowed at court because they had made agreements that his testimony wasn't going to be at court. But the hospitals clearly wrote down in their nursing reports that the mean man shot him. And it's documented more than once.
The hospital documented Danny's statement that the mean man shot him. So my question is, did they ever get Danny's accounts of what this mean man looked like, right? Because I know there's a sketch, but my thought was that the sketch came from Diane Downs, what she saw, who she fought. But if the children also saw a mean man, did the sketch match Diane Downs' sketch?
And so they weren't allowed to give that testimony at court.
I wonder why.
I just learned the other day that during the closing statement of Fred Hughes, I guess that he mentioned that. I'm going to go, and I have the court transcripts, and I'm going to go through that to see the fact. And he actually mentioned Danny in his closing arguments, thus causing a breach, and counts for a mistrial because he was breaking the only rules that he set during his final closing argument.
Can you talk about Ann Rule and what did that mean to have this famous writer in the courtroom? What was the impact of that? How did that make you as a reporter feel?
This happened over close to 40 years ago. It's about to be 40 years. Is it? Yeah, just about. If it was a mistrial, why are they waiting until... this interview happened in 2013. So this has been, it's been 10 years. May 17th of 2013 since this interview happened. My question is why are they, were any reasons to even call this a mistrial or to even say we need to appeal this? Because all resources have been exhausted. as far as Diane Downs and her appeals. I'm not hearing people running to say that the court, the system got it wrong this time. But I could be wrong. I don't know. I wasn't born yet. I was born in '84. So when they were in trial, I was born. So.
Well, Anne sat next to me a lot of the time, and it lent a certain star power to the room, and the fact that she was there, in a way, I guess you could say, reinforced the fact that she was going to be doing a book, and she really doesn't come from the standpoint of the wrong guy did it. That's not a part of her genre. It's usually the genre that she writes about is, this is a trial, the person did it, they're going to go down. The detectives are the people that ferret out the truth. And so there really isn't a great degree of skepticism in a lot of her work. Now, I've read a lot of her books. Stranger Beside Me was a good book about Ted Bundy. But she doesn't really come from the standpoint as investigative reporters or investigators, defense investigators, from the standpoint that there could be problems with the investigation, or that there.
Well, she's just a writer. She was a writer. She passed away a couple years ago. But it was said that Anne Rule really put herself in a lot of these cases that she would write about, like Ted Bundy. She was interviewing people. She was doing a lot of what like YouTubers nowadays are doing, where they're actually going to the trial, where they're actually covering things, when they're actually pulling case files and giving commentary. She was really kind of there, and maybe one of the only ones that was doing that, but not from a defense investigative point, because she had her audience at the time, and she still does. Um, she's a writer. That she was a writer. That's what she was doing. She was telling the story based off of what her audience wanted her to say. So I don't really fault Anne Rule for writing a book that was a bestseller, that then turned to a movie, because it wasn't her role to investigate. That's the defense, the prosecution's role, right? It's like putting responsibility on like YouTubers to solve a crime. I don't want to do that. I'm giving commentary. That's all. It's not my job to solve the crime.
Could be alternate theories, or there could be areas to investigate that need to be brought forward so that the person gets a fair trial.
She's basically going to take the word of the police without a lot of question.
Well, I mean, that's been the history of her books, and many of the books have included subjects and characters, which, there isn't a lot of doubt there. The person has made statements, or the person has been seen a number of times, like Ted Bundy, in the midst of doing his crime. So, in a case like Diane's, where there was at least some question, it certainly added to the idea that the police had basically figured it out and this was a done deal.
Right. James, you've explained to me that there was quite an age gap and there were many siblings in your family, so you didn't necessarily have a super close relationship with Diane, but can you talk about growing up with Diane a little bit? Tell me, what comes to mind when I ask that?
What comes
Age gap, and they weren't very close as siblings, so they had a significant age gap. And that's important, because I think, like, how well would you know your sibling other than you just don't want your sibling to be found guilty of a crime? How well do you know your sibling? Curious.
in mind when I think about Diane is pigeons. She had homing pigeons in Phoenix, and she liked horses and animals. Didn't really interact a whole bunch. There was like 6 years in between us, 5 years, 6 years in between us. So we didn't really interact a whole lot. But, yeah.
So they didn't really interact a whole lot. 6 years of a difference. I think that's what I caught him say. Hold up, let me go back a little bit.
Didn't really interact a whole bunch. There was like 6 years in between us, 5 years.
6 years, 5 years or 6. And it's the closed caption is not really capturing his words. It says penis. I'm sure that that's not what it meant to have written. But it's 6 or 7 years. They didn't interact a whole bunch. Like 6 years or 5 or 6. He goes between that.
6 years in between us.
Was going to us. He didn't. It's the way he's speaking.
Interact a whole lot.
They didn't interact a whole lot.
Yeah.
But she was certainly a victim of abuse. Her first husband and she, Mr. Steve Downs, had quite a combative, turbulent relationship.
Yeah.
So he says, well, she's certainly a victim of abuse. I don't take that from her. I wouldn't be surprised if she is. Um, and she self-disclosed that. Now, I don't know what the details are. I also believe that those kids are also victims of abuse based on the household that they had because they saw things. When she talks about the whole gun situation, putting it on her head, made me wonder, well, where were those kids when all this stuff was going down?
I sure did. I just remember times, there was a time we were in Flagstaff, we were living up there, and he jumped up on top of her and he was hitting her on the sides, and she was like just cuddled up like that, so he wouldn't be able to hurt her. And then he stopped and she got up and she started beating on him.
How tall is Diane?
So they would beat on each other.
I'm going, she's probably about 5'7",
Okay.
5'8". I really,
She's not exactly petite then. I
She might
mean,
be
she's a
5'9".
pretty small person though, at least at that point, right?
yeah.
So you saw her recently. What kind of a visit did you have? I know, of course, we've talked about this at
Yeah,
great length, but for
yeah.
the people watching this, you had a pretty good visit,
Had
didn't
a
you?
really good visit.
Talk to me about her intelligence. I read what she writes, and I get the impression that this has to be, a cohesive, intelligent person writing this.
Yeah, she's yeah, there's absolutely nothing about this case, obviously, that she doesn't know or understand, right? But she has taken everything, and she's just incredibly scary smart. You know, the way she pieces puzzles together. Yeah, very smart.
Right. And an analytical mind with math and
Yeah,
codes
absolutely.
and things
Yeah,
like this
yeah,
too, right?
totally, yeah. Some people would say that
Rolling,
she's lost her mind, but other people would say that she's actually found it.
Right. She's been locked up for how many
Some people would say that she lost her mind. Some people would say that she's actually found it. I'm using direct quotes from the brother.
years?
29.
29 years.
She spent 5 years in solitary confinement where she got to see nobody.
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, 29. Now this is 2013, so it's been several years. 5 years in solitary confinement. Part of it was because of her escaping, I think, and whatever other things were going on in the jail or in the prison when she was there.
24 hours a day.
I worked on another case in the past, the case of Captain Jeffrey McDonald, the Green Beret doctor, convicted of killing his family. He was also injured in the event that led to his family's death. That injury of his was greatly minimized. But you really opened my eyes when you explained to me how badly Diane was shot that night. Can you talk about that? This wasn't a flesh wound. The bullet actually struck the bone.
Yeah, the bullet struck the bone. I never really paid attention to it, because it's just a got shot in the arm. But she's got a scar that's like 4 or 5 inches long going up her arm, where it actually took the bone, it shattered the bone in half, and I guess the arm was actually laying up, where its fingers were pointing towards her bicep from the end of the shooting. But the problem is that how it got to the hospital. Let's talk about how it got to the hospital. It got to the hospital and it was straightened up, wrapped up in a towel that was like, I'm going to use Anne Rule's movie, perfectly folded. It's
Right.
like,
I'm just going to tell you the truth. The more I hear this, the more I think, honestly, that was a very, very lame thing for the prosecution to put so much into, because who really witnessed that exquisitely well-folded towel? I mean, it seems like
right.
a distraction. I mean, Eric, what was your thought on the towel?
There were so many things about the trial that, as you listen to them, you got the impression that it was a case that was certainly very circumstantial, but that cumulatively, it was hard not to think that the way it was put on, that Diane was completely guilty. Sure. It really was. Some of the small details, I think, kind of went over the jury's head. I mean, for example, the towel, I don't think it really registered with a lot of the jury from what all of us, the court watchers, could tell. So there was that. There was the fact that there were the letters to gentlemen in Arizona. I mean, there was that took the sensational aspects about Diane's life, about her sexual escapades, that certainly were a lot bigger than towel.
Right.
But okay, and this is where the defense should have played a bigger role. And I'm just playing devil's advocate. I was like, well, if I was the defense, because part of the argument is that she drove 5 to 7 miles, people were having to move out of the way, so because she was so slow and it was like a 1-lane type of road or whatever. Why didn't the defense step up and say, well, she's bleeding out, the injury to her arm prevented her to get to the hospital, she wrapped a towel to stop the bleeding, Um, there were certain things that could have been made an argument of. And if she shot herself, why shoot the arm? Why not the leg? Right? I'm just thinking of like various ways the defense could have really stepped it up to have caused some reasonable doubt. But they just, I guess they didn't. She didn't have the best defense at the time. Prosecution, I believe, found motive and did its job.
A lot of the other minor things that certainly came up.
Right.
That just became kind of a sideshow. I mean, it really was. It became kind of, in the end, especially with the pregnancy and the birth, a circus type atmosphere, certainly.
Actually, she was actually a surrogate parent for people that couldn't have babies. People nowadays, when they get paid and they do this, they're almost revered on TV that that they had enough heart that they would carry a baby for a family that couldn't have a baby. And people say that she was a surrogate parent and that she did that, and it's like she's just this wicked woman who could give away a baby. But it's like it's the way things are portrayed, man.
Right, I know, and convicted through the press. It's a really, I mean, that movie, and I've never watched the movie. We talked about this. I mean, I don't want to. I will at some point watch it, but I don't want to be impacted by it. I mean, Farrah Fawcett, what a major actress to cast in that part. It doesn't get it. At the time, did it get any? Could it have been any?
No.
They really invested a lot into that, didn't they?
Everybody loved their Farrah.
And Anne Rule with the Duran Duran song. Did that play a big part? I mean, the fact
Was that really at the trial?
Hungry Like the Wolf.
Yeah, that was at the trial.
Was it?
Can
you tell the demeanor of the courtroom?
Well, I mean,
Well, see, the brother's asking the reporter, was that really at the trial? Was he not there for that? Apparently not.
I mean, there was just this moment when they played the music, and that she seemed to be connecting to the music and the beat and everything. That certainly, Anne Rule,
I know how
made
it
made it a very,
Do you
very
remember that?
big deal. Yeah, and so these little items that just seem to be not evidentiary, but were indicative of what the prosecution says was a woman who did not, care about her children enough that this music would have, if she said it was playing, this music would have triggered, an awful response from the average person.
Definitely would.
So, so she connected to the music while they were playing it in trial. So that scene in Small Sacrifices when Farrah Fawcett is jamming out, that was actually Diane Downs in trial. Jamming out. She was feeling the music. Yeah, that play. Like, did nobody talk to Diane Downs? There's got to be some etiquette when you're facing these kinds of charges, yo. Is it just me that sees that? I don't know.
Yes, exactly. And so as a result, these are just things that seem to add weight to what the prosecution was saying at the time. So, and really there could be a disconnect. She could be just exhibiting inappropriate behavior in a number of ways.
Here's the really weird part to that whole statement, because that is the weirdest freaking thing I've ever heard. But I don't mean to come back to the very beginning, though, but I will probably about 100 times. She never held a gun, never fired a gun, was not near a gun when it was being fired, had no blood spatter and gunpowder residue on her. So how did she shoot somebody to have a reaction to a tape? She shouldn't be the one on trial here.
And why would a person aiming to murder her children drive them to the hospital? And at the end of the day, that's a very, very hard one to go around. What's it going to take? What would it theoretically take to get that? I mean, her appeals are done. Everything's, the course has been run. But this is what you're doing right now. What would it take to get Diane out of prison? Can you feature it? I mean, and what's your thought? And I don't mean to go on, but what's your thought on the fact that she could admit, she could say, I did this and be paroled by now, but she holds on to her innocence. How does that move you?
Well, I mean, these are some of the things I've read over the years that have made me always kind of wonder. And the private investigator who worked on her post-conviction relief, now this goes back 10 years now at least, with Richard Cohn, is the question of the numbers of things, missed opportunities by the defense to bring alternate theories. And so really, all of these appeals and post-conviction relief have all run. And so really, you're down to things like pardons. You're down to things like new evidence that comes forward that you can get it in front of a judge and it's substantial enough. Maybe they may hold a hearing about it. But really, you would probably need some kind of confession.
So this is perfect because it'll transition us over to her parole board letters. Okay, keep that in mind.
from somebody who came forward and said, I am
Right.
the killer,
Right.
that was there that night.
And there is a man
I don't
who,
even think that would do it.
yeah. Well,
You don't think so? Oh.
but there is a man who has been identified repeatedly. This man was apparently part of a motorcycle club that had illegal activity going on. Pat Horton, the prosecutor, was ultimately the person who left his role as a prosecutor and became the attorney for the same motorcycle club he'd been investigating. And that is all central to this.
Well, I remember Pat Horton, the district attorney. There were several articles written about one of them in the Oregon magazine by Dana Timms about the kind of loose sort of what I would call rogue operation that some of the officers that were in an interagency narcotics team at the time, the very loose and fast and loose things that were going on with that particular group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that certainly that was documented.
Mm-hmm.
And they had interviews with people.
It's also being investigated.
And I think that article was just one of the many things that came out about that period of time down in Springfield and in Lane County that would lead you to believe that perhaps evidence handling wasn't what it could have been, and that there are certainly questions left over from that era.
Yeah, and you can actually look up on the Salem News, not Salem News, but the Eugene Register Guard in their archives about the Lane County Narcotics Task Force that was being investigated by Thomas Coffin, who was a federal investigator who was appointed to investigate them. More specifically, he was appointed to investigate Pat Horton.
And I'm not sure what the total end of it was. I
think people just moved around. And
yeah, he actually got a conviction. Well, he actually got a hung jury the first time around, and then he got a sealed conviction where you don't really know what the conviction is. One of those. So.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much because this is really a very important subject. Anyone serving time for a crime they didn't commit, regardless of the circumstances, is totally unacceptable. And we have a new attorney general in Oregon now who seems more open-minded. And we have you, Eric, doing this role for other people. So it gives me hope that if there is more to this, that it can be uncovered, and maybe there is hope still for Diane to not spend the rest of her life in prison. She'd like to see her father before this thing's over.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. And it's really, I didn't get to 100 times, but she never held a gun, man. How could you shoot somebody?
It is a tough.
Again, his argument is she never held a gun. Gunshot residue can be removed by action, such as washing hands, wiping clothes, or brushing it off. So the absence of residue does not prove that the person did not recently fire a gun.
It's a tough point to work from, because it's hard to believe their case based on that.
So like I said, there are people out here that believe that Diane Downs is innocent. And some of you guys may feel the same way too. Just let me know in the comments, of course, and your opinion is always welcome here. Let's move on to the next part. And note that this video is going to have timestamps, so it'll be easier for everybody to navigate. So right now, what Diane Downs is doing is challenging the parole board, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, anybody who's ever diagnosed her. She is challenging them, and she's putting things together in these letters, highlighting things that would help in that favor, right? Which I guess it would make sense if you're trying to make an argument as to why you're better. Now, on September 25th of 2023, Diane Downs decided to write a letter to the Parole Board of Oregon. It is very interesting because in this letter, in the letters that are included here, she is trying to dig holes to her diagnosis, to her mental health diagnosis, which officially is severe narcissistic personality disorder. She says, "Honorable members, in 1984, I was sentenced under ORS, and the code is there. The 1984 version of ORS says, nothing in this section shall preclude a prisoner from submitting a request for a parole consideration hearing prior to a 2-year review. Now, the OAR 255-38-005 says, applications received more often than every 2 years will carry a greater burden in establishing that their request is reasonable." Okay, I intend to meet that burden in this letter. Every time I'm seen by the Oregon Board of Parole, members say they're denying me parole because I have not been counseled by a psychologist or a psychiatrist to become better. Notice how she put the quotes better. And she's also challenging the board by applying. Applications received more often than every 2 years will carry a greater burden in establishing that the request is reasonable. So she's trying to put all the paperwork together to say, I have a reasonable request for a parole board to hear my pleading. Now, I find it interesting that she says that members say they're denying me parole because I've not been counseled by a psychologist or a psychiatrist to become better. Now, I would probably bet my money that during the time that Diane Downs has been in prison for the many, many years, she probably has seen a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist or a social worker. I'm pretty sure that somebody has counseled her. Um, it would be kind of weird. I mean, I guess it has happened where people sit in jail and aren't offered any type of rehabilitation services. I mean, let me know. And not to say that she um, can't be rehabilitated, but this letter itself really concerns me. She then puts better than what I asked. Better than what I asked. ORS 144.228 1B says, at the parole considerations hearing, the prisoner shall be given a release date if the conditions which made the prisoner dangerous, and she puts in there severe narcissistic personality disorder, is absent or in remission. The board members verbally interpreted this statute to mean they need a clean bill of health diagnosis. For 40 years, I've been chasing that imaginary hair. She really did say imaginary hair. That's like the imaginary rabbit. She said hair. She wrote this. For 40 years, I've been chasing that imaginary hair and only just learned it doesn't even exist. I don't believe that there is a cure for severe narcissistic personality disorder. Um, no, I know that there isn't a cure for that. Um, there is talk therapy. There is, it's never in remission. There is talk therapy. It's never in remission. It's not something that you could just take a pill and, I'm going to cure myself from being a narcissist. No, that doesn't go away. There's things that can be done, but a narcissistic personality disorder is typically treated with talk therapy, and it is a lifelong situation. Okay. And part of the issue with narcissism is the challenge for a lot of narcissistic people is can they truly engage in therapy, right? Can they truly have a sense of self in psychotherapy? Now, with narcissism, with such a personality disorder, can they understand their own problem? Can they really have enough self awareness? This is in that, like I said, it's not to say that there's no cure to it, but it is something, it's the developing of such self awareness. And because this is a lifelong thing, there's always going to have to be some talk therapy or some follow up to understanding how their behavior impacts others. This is why it requires ongoing treatment and service. Now, for someone like Diane Downs, who says that the prisoner shall be given a release date if the conditions which made the prisoner dangerous, severe narcissistic personality disorder, is absent or is in remission. Now, I would think that this would be one factor of why Diane Downs is not released. She's also hasn't acknowledged or taken ownership of the crime that she committed, of the crime that she was found guilty of. Is that part of her being a narcissist? Potentially. I'm not her doctor, I'm not diagnosing her. But it's an interesting thing to understand. Now, this is a letter that she wrote, right? She put this together. She pulled exactly what she wanted to say in this letter. And it's very well done. She very well, she highlights everything, she puts everything. She's a very smart woman. Okay. So she knows what the board wants to see because she's been sitting on a couple of them. So she has studied, and she said, I'm coming here, okay, for consideration. I'm going to meet this burden of proof so that I can be given a new date for a parole board hearing. Now, let me say something real quick, and I know this is totally a little bit off topic, but can you imagine like having a VR headset in a prison to determine if you are better, right? Like I'm thinking of Lima Yaremovich Ara in treating such sociopaths like Diane Downs. That is very scary because you definitely need a human review for such things like this. That's my thought. Like you need a therapist. You need somebody with degrees and studies and years in the field to really make a good assessment. And even those people that have been in the field for many years make mistakes, right? So I would never depend on a virtual reality headset to do any type of rehabilitation in a correctional facility, especially when they're dealing with somebody like Diane Downs. You got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. The board members verbally interpreted this statute to mean they need a clean bill of health diagnosis. For 40 years, I've been chasing that imaginary hair and only just learned it doesn't even exist. Would it be an ego thing for this person, for Diane, to believe that her diagnosis doesn't even exist? So she highlights the parole board work release clemencies, like where she got the codes from. You can see her highlighting the paperwork there, okay? She says, in 2020, the board acknowledged that they received all of the psych reports in my e-file. Member Taylor dismissed these reports as girl talk. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd never seen the reports, but I knew I'd met with geriatric psychiatrist Dr. S. Rossi and clinical psychologist Shoji for 2 years. Each had their own training and agenda. Both had complete access to my e-file and the officers who observed me on a daily basis. What does she mean by each had their own training and agenda? I had to know what was in those reports after my 2020 hearing. I requested the release of those documents to me. After reading them, I couldn't fault member Taylor's assessment of girl talk. That's how it looked to me, too. So why did the board put so much emphasis on psychiatric counseling if it mounted to so little? That is a good question, believe it or not. If a parole board is to look at everything, right? Psychiatric reports, mental health reports, reports from, the guards, whatever is written in that file, okay? And the question, I think that this is a very valid question. I think that this is something that needs to be answered. So why did the board put so much emphasis on psychiatric counseling if it amounted to so little? So when she took what parole board member Taylor said as girl talk, as real literal, right? Like a real serious, what did you mean by that? And what did that even mean? So she requested her own files and she's like, I'm gonna look through these files, right? And she's gonna challenge. And I think that people should, if you're sitting in prison for so many years, yeah, request your files. You want to sit on parole boards, so you can make a argument. Absolutely, it's your time to talk about the case. However, why did the board put so much emphasis on psychiatric counseling if it amounted to so little? I think it's a good question. Should be answered. Just say. In August 2023, I expressed my dismay with the California mental health system failure to diagnose me after years of counseling. The mental health clinician said that was a good thing. How? I asked. The Oregon board requires a diagnosis saying I have no personality disorder before they'll consider me for parole. How did she come up with that conclusion? Let me stop right there. She wrote this, right? How did she come up with that conclusion when she says she was given severe narcissistic personality disorder is absent or in remission? So I think the question then becomes, if she is a narcissist and it's part of her disorder, how does she know she's in remission of it? How? I asked. The Oregon board requires a diagnosis saying I have no personality disorder before they'll consider me for parole. The clinician said I must be mistaken because no parole board would stake a parole docket on a mental diagnosis that simply doesn't exist. It does exist. When did she determine that this doesn't exist? It does exist. Now, unless there were some updates to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, narcissism exists. And you guys can Google search it. It exists, okay? And again, narcissism is defined as a comprising a pervasive pattern of grandiose in fantasy or behavior, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by the presence of at least 5 of the following criteria: a grandiose sense of self-importance, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. I think the crime would be like that ideal love part, chasing a man that didn't want to have children, right? A belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with or other special or high status people or institutions. Damn, that sounds like a lot of YouTubers. I'm just saying. A need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, interpersonality explosive behavior, a lack of empathy, envy of others, or a belief that others are envious of him or her, a demonstration of arrogance and haughty behaviors or attitudes. NPD is not associated with any specific defining physical characteristics. However, physical consequences of substance use with which NPD is often associated may be apparent on examination. Mental status examination may reveal depressed mood. Patients in the throes of narcissistic grandiosity may display signs of hypomania or mania. It's a real thing. It's a real thing. In the latest DSM-5, okay? The clinician said, I must be, okay, I read that part. He absolutely refused to believe that Oregon Board of Parole and Oregon legislators crafted a law that required a prison inmates to be diagnosed as healthy when in fact there is no such thing. So I said, you're saying I'd have to fake a mental illness, be diagnosed with a manufactured disorder to be treated and cured of a disorder to satisfy the board? He said, now doesn't that sound foolish? Yeah, I agree. But that's what the board keeps telling me. He still didn't believe me. But his explanation prompted me to re-examine all of the mental health reports I received for my e-file. I totally understand what the psychs were saying for years. That is the reason I'm requesting a parole consideration hearing at this time. I have new evidence that will change the opinion of this board. Do you guys think that her new evidence is going to find her not guilty? She wasn't even there when she committed the crime. What do you guys think is going to happen? Suddenly, Diane Downs is going to walk free? They're going to tell her, congratulations, you're walking free? What new evidence could she have? Let me know in the comments. And yes, I am being sarcastic. I'm just, saying. I am. In search of a psych. Because the ORS 144228 require me to be cleared of the severe narcissistic personality disorder labeled in order to be granted an early parole consideration in 1998, I began looking for mental health treatment. 1985, Oregon. Bear in mind, Oregon legislators crafted a law that required prisoners' initial personality disorder be absent in order to be paroled within their matrix. And remember that Oregon Parole Board members want a diagnosis that clears the prisoner of a severe personality disorder before considering them for parole. You'd think there'd be a psychiatric protocol for assisting Oregon prisoners with finding the mental health treatment that would aid the prisoner with meeting that mandate of the law. But there isn't. Oregon set the bar so high no one would be able to clear it, and then took away the prisoner's pole vault. Okay, I'm not disputing that there's probably some issues with Oregon and their parole boards and their psychiatric stuff and whatnot. But the last I remember about any type of prison reform that has been made, people have to do trades, jobs. They're expected or at least encouraged to get into therapy, to, do anger management, to do these kinds of things. I'm just trying to figure out if while she's writing this, if she's not also experiencing some of her narcissistic traits, because that's part of the disorder, right? If you think about it, a demonstration of arrogance, okay, a grandiose sense of self importance. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff going on in the Oregon mental health prison system. Definitely, there's probably a lot of stuff in there, and it's probably not a lot of resources. I would definitely give her that. But I'm just wondering, is she creating this loophole or is she trying to create a loophole to see a board? I sought mental health counseling in 1985, the year after I arrived at Oregon's Women's Correctional Center. A psychiatrist called me out to say his job was to make me adapt to doing time since I was looking at a 25-year sentence. I requested counseling. He prescribed me a mood stabilizer, which I took for 3 days. He saw me again and said I needed to get used to doing time. End of counseling. Wow. In 1988, New Jersey, when I asked the New Jersey doctor how to get an appointment with the mental health department, he looked at me like I had 3 heads and said there was no mental health department in New Jersey. I explained that Oregon law required me to receive counseling so I could be diagnosed with no severe personality disorder. He said no law would require such a thing. Everyone keeps saying that. Everyone except the Oregon Board of Parole members. Just this morning, as I was writing this to you, I looked up the word diagnosis in the Webster's Dictionary. This is what it says. Diagnosis, the art or act of identifying a disease from its signs and symptoms. Holy cow, no wonder the mental health community keeps trying to rearrange my idea of a diagnosis, except it's not my idea. I've been repeating the words of Oregon Parole Board members who know as little about psychiatry as I do. In 1993, California, again, I tried to get mental health counseling. When I arrived in California, again I was shut out. It was crazy. Dr. White, 1998. I was explaining my frustration concerning my inability to meet the letter of Oregon law to my yard crew boss one day in 1998. I said it was pretty clear no one wants to help me challenge the Oregon Board of Parole. I couldn't think of any other reasons I've been denied mental health counseling for 14 years in prison. Now, if any of this is true, that she actually has been denied, that should be a concern, right? She shouldn't have been denied. But then that would need to be looked into. Just a thought. If we're trying to rehabilitate somebody, just a thought. My boss thought it was wrong to create a law that basically requires psychiatric treatment, then prevents a person from being seen by a psych. So he put in a referral for me to be seen by a psych. Mental health is required to see a prisoner when a correctional officer makes the referral. In 1998, psychologist Dr. Ann White did a full mental health assessment of me and saw me for a year. The board acknowledged they'd received Dr. White's report and dismissed it as worthless. I didn't know why until I requested my own copy of Dr. White's report. I couldn't believe it. I saw what Member Taylor saw. Nothing. She found that I was sad, depressed, even because I missed my children and my family, but that was it. Or so it seemed. Dr. White's report is what prompted my discussion with the mental health clinician in August of May this year. After our talk and my re-education concerning the word diagnosis, I re-examined Dr. White's report. It bears repeating. Dr. White had access to my entire C file. She knew everything about me from the record and from the staff who interacted with me. Knowing all that, she wrote, I scored within normal limits, WNL, on all of the following: appearance, behavior, cognitive, perception disturbances, thought content, interview attitude, current suicidality, current violence risk. There's no such thing as a healthy personality diagnosis. But if there was, it would simply be the lack of a personality disorder diagnosis. That is all that's required to parole me, and I should have been paroled in 1998 when I requested and was denied a hearing. So Dr. White does a mental health, I guess, evaluation. I'm trying to see this. A mental health assessment. And a mental health assessment is not the same thing as a psychological assessment. They're very different. Different kinds of tests, length of time. One might be more of a questionnaire, one might be more observant, one might take just time. I'm just letting you guys know. One takes more time, one has more validity than another. So I don't know how much weight I would have put into a mental health assessment. And she provides a treatment plan and she provides all the notes of where she was, what is it? What is the word? Within normal limits. WNL, within normal limits. So she's within normal limits of sleep, behavior pattern, speech, affect. I don't know, is this Dr. White's writing or her writing? Well, I guess this is Diane Downs' writing. None of my 14-year prison records current, so she's trying to tell us that she's not suicidal and she's not a current violent risk. And in the last 14 years, she doesn't have any records as such. Okay, this is just an assessment. This is what it looks like. It doesn't really look like an actual psych eval, which would probably have been more helpful than this. But it's just a copy of that. And this is actually an intake, condensed initial intake form. So was there more to this intake? There's nothing else to this. This wouldn't suffice, in my opinion, to say, yeah, Diane Downs is totally healthy of personality. She's got a healthy personality. Which is an interesting question to pose because none of us have a healthy personality if you think about it. Then again, there's a lot of people that don't go and kill their own children, right? Just saying. A lot of this is scribbling and I don't understand, can't read any of that. She puts in here psychiatric hospital, none. Psychotropic medication, none. Outpatient treatment, none. Mental health treatment while incarcerated or paroled, none. So she put none for mental health treatment. So she hasn't had any treatment to really address the issues. Suicidal behavior denies. She denies it. Violent behavior denies. Of Sherilyn, 7-year-old daughter. Okay, that's what the doctor wrote there. I could read a little bit here and it says the second at 31 years old escaping from prison. Fell off the fence. And this is just, she's self-reporting and the doctor's writing down maybe impactful medical history, traumas. 20 years old, hit head, and something something. I can't read that. The handwriting is horrible. Same with the cognitive. Without, I mean, there's just nothing else. So this is just a mental health assessment. That's all. Self-reported, and she's signing it and writing it off. But it doesn't say that she's without narcissistic personality disorder. Keep that in mind. So I want us to jump to a report of a Dr. Cuppers. I think that's how you say that, from 1999. He says, in 1999, I contacted a psychiatrist with a long record of testifying in criminal proceedings. I figured Dr. Terry Cuppers. In 1999, I contacted a psychiatrist with a long record of testifying in criminal proceedings. I figured Dr. Terry Cuppers would have a better understanding of Oregon law no one else in California seems to believe existed. After reviewing my C file and talking to Dr. Ann White at CCWF, Dr. Cuppers found numerous reasons to determine I do not suffer from a severe personality disorder. He found no history of prior violence before 1983, no history of repeated violence after 1983, no substance abuse, no serious mental illness. Dr. Cuppers didn't simply imply the absence of a personality disorder by omitting a diagnosis of a disorder. He boldly wrote, I suffer from no personality disorder. If I remember a little bit of what the defense said in Diane Downs, they were arguing that she suffered from, abuse, trauma, a personality situation, mental health issues, which was the reason why, a lot of what was going on, why she was perceived as this woman of steel. So is her argument now that she doesn't have a personality disorder, which means she should be let go and be set free? Is Diane Downs ever really going to take ownership of the crime she committed? Does she feel like because no personality disorder is a thing, that's the only thing that would need to be, said by a doctor in order for her to be released? The fact that I've suffered from no personality disorder since at least 1999 is evidence of the fact that I have met the mandate of the Oregon statute requiring my release from prison. Oregon laws are so ambiguous that this esteemed and lettered psychiatrist felt the need to give an active voice to the fact that I suffer from no personality disorder. A better understanding of the reason he felt the need to do that is because Oregon Parole Board members continue to require a diagnosis of good mental health before paroling prisoners sentenced under ORS, and there simply isn't any such diagnosis in the psych world. Yes, okay. The board is now in possession of new evidence that would make a difference in determining whether or not to parole me. This is information they were not previously privy to. So here is the Terry Cuppers confidential file, who he is a board certified psychiatrist who's testified, and I'm reading what is highlighted here. But again, I will leave the link in the description box so you guys can check out these documents. This is interesting. So when he starts his evaluation, and this is, so that I'm clear, this is a letter that Dr. Cuppers wrote to the parole board, okay? She says here that she did not meet Miss Downs in person since she is incarcerated at the California Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla. So Diane Downs is very, she went out of her way to contact a doctor to help her in this case. The doctor couldn't really meet with her. Keep that in mind as it pertains to the assessment, okay? And this is what, 1999? So there was no Zoom calls. I don't think 1999 we had Zoom or FaceTime or anything like that. So what real assessment was this? Okay. He said, I have not been able to find the time to make the trip in a timely fashion, but I have corresponded with her, and I spoke with her on the phone on June 4th, 1999. Reviewed the documents related to her case. Thus, it would not be fair for me to offer a report of a complete psychiatric examination. Absolutely, it would not be fair for him to say that this is it. But I feel that the contact I have had with her, my knowledge of her psychiatric and correction situation, and my expertise in forensic corrections permits me to offer a valid opinion about a certain matter before the parole board, especially the issue of severe personality disorder and dangerousness. Yikes. Okay. So he never met with her face to face, but he wrote a report for her. He's like, I feel like I know this girl, I know her well enough, and so I'm well established in psychiatry, okay, to give my thoughts about a personality disorder that he didn't diagnose, that he's only read about through documents of other doctors. He hasn't spent an hour in person with her. That is crazy. I wouldn't, I'm sorry, I'm not a psychiatrist, but if I was, I would not put my license up like that or, do that. But then this is 1999, When Miss Downs entered prison in 1984, her first offense, she was labeled a dangerous offender under Oregon Administration Rule 255-35025. Part of the rationale for that label was a psychiatrist's opinion in court that Ms. Downs suffered from a severe personality disorder. A lot has changed in our clinical understanding both of dangerousness and severe personality disorders since that time. For instance, it is very clear from research in the intervening years that women who commit violent crimes are more likely compared to men to harm someone known to them for personal rather than money-seeking reasons. Men are more likely to be violent towards strangers in the act of committing a crime such as robbery, and women who serve time in prison are more likely to go straight and never again commit a violent crime once they are released. Men are more likely to reoffend. In fact, it is very rare that a woman who has served a sentence for a violent crime will be rearrested for another violent crime. Of course, a certain number of women are rearrested, often for drug-related offenses. Now, yeah, I would even this report's from 1999, but I would agree to a certain extent that uh, we have a lot of people that have severe personality disorders. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that people can't function with a severe personality disorder. I have family members with severe personality disorders, right? And they function well, but because it's a lifelong thing. There's therapy, there's follow up that happens. There's also just because you have a severe personality disorder does not take away from what's the word? The accountability that you need to take from those actions. So for Diane Downs, who committed a crime, who has continuously said she didn't do it, she didn't commit the crime. It wasn't her. It was a masked man. I mean, her story changed 3 times. Accountability doesn't seem to quite exist for Diane Downs, right? Acceptance of that crime that she committed, she doesn't get it. Is that part of her narcissism? Her personality disorder? Potentially. Potentially. Now, it's interesting that she highlights uh, psychiatry and other mental health professionals have learned a lot about predicting the likelihood of future violence since 1984. While a severe personality disorder would have been considered a risk factor for future violence then, it is certainly not considered to be an important risk factor now. So, history of prior repeated violence is the number one risk factor by far in predicting an individual's potential for future violence. Diane Downs self-disclosed DV in her marriage. She says she pointed a gun, and she shot a gun or whatever. Y'all remember that? How does that not make her a risk factor? Serious and ongoing substance abuse and untreated serious mental health illnesses are 2 other very serious risk factors. But people with serious mental health illnesses who comply with medications are no more at risk for perpetrating violence than is the general public. So she highlights a lot of this. which is what the psychiatrist's argument is. And the doctor says, turning to Miss Downs' situation, she had no prior incidents of violence prior to the terrible crime that she committed. Okay? But he puts, she had no prior incidents of violence prior to the terrible crime that led to her conviction. And from my review of her conduct while in correctional settings, she has not had a tendency towards violence since entering prison. These facts alone make it extremely unlikely that she is, in fact, a dangerous offender. He puts in here, she highlights, I conclude the diagnosis severe personality disorder is no longer applicable in her case. So then she's highlighting and like putting little plus signs on things that she wants the board to see. So we left off on, I conclude the diagnosis severe personality disorder is no longer applicable in her case. I've examined the list of disciplinary write-ups Miss Downs has received while incarcerated. Of course, there's a list. I've never met a prisoner who does not get written up periodically. But what is striking is how absent violence is from her list. Miss Downs has been attacked by other prisoners on several occasions. This has something to do with the notoriety of her case, but she has not tended to respond violently. She has several escapes attempts noted in her custody file, but none involved any violence, and in only one case did she actually proceed with a plan, or walk away early in her term. Other write-ups are minor or involved refusing an order. She highlights, Diane Downs highlights, while she's been attacked and even shot by correctional officers, she's never struck out at anyone. This is an impressive record, considering the pressures on her. Now, this is very interesting. For example, she gives an example as to why she doesn't have severe personality disorder. Listen to the example that this doctor gives. For example, while being transported from Washington to Oregon on March 23, 1993, she complained about the leg irons being too tight and cutting into her flesh. The officers transporting her refused to loosen them. She has suffered scars on her ankles ever since. Now, I'm assuming, I don't want to speak for the officer, but if she has a record of trying to escape, he probably was like, you're not escaping. I'm going to make sure you're tight in there. Although clearly it was severe enough to cut into her flesh. But did he see pictures of this? Or is he going by what Diane Downs is saying? I mean, what are the reports that he received to give that statement? She has suffered scars on her ankles ever since. But the impressive thing is that she did not strike out against the officer, even when her ankles were bleeding. Here is evidence that she did not suffer from a severe personality disorder and not even violence prone. So because she didn't act violently towards the officer when the cuffs were cutting into her ankles, that means she doesn't have a severe personality disorder. She has also been repeatedly sexually harassed by a male officer and has not been violent in response. And she has refused over the years to respond violently to assaults from other prisoners. All of this leads me to conclude that she is not at all dangerous. Okay, so does having a severe personality disorder mean that you're dangerous? Why would he think that? I mean, I get that the initial diagnosis is that she's dangerous. Well, yeah, the crime that she committed, the fact that she lied. I'm kind of wondering if this doctor believes that she's guilty or not. And if that even is an issue at this point, when he's writing this in 1999. There is little risk that she will commit violent acts after she's released. Meanwhile, and this is something that she also highlights, okay? And she also writes a note. This doctor has been examining prisoners for more than 25 years. He is neither gullible nor naive. Okay. He should know better than just to write a report when he hasn't met Diane Downs, right? Meanwhile, there are quite a few factors that make me think she is a very good prospect for successful post-release adjustment. She is constantly taking part in educational opportunities while incarcerated, and she is kept in contact with their family. Participation in educational programs and continuous contact with family are the two factors that correlate most strongly with post release success and inversely with re-arrest and recidivism. In addition, she has voluntarily sought and pursued psychotherapy. She began seeing Dr. Ann White in July of 1998 and continues to see her. I would be curious to know what her reports look like in the time that she has seen Dr. White. I believe it was for a year. She has a work history prior to incarceration and vocational plans after she is released, and her work skills have been enhanced by her educational and work pursuits while incarcerated. Finally, and very importantly, she is obviously a quite pleasant, motivated, sincere, hardworking, and gracious woman. Of course, she has made mistakes, and she is the first to admit it, but she has thought quite a lot about her life and made very constructive plans to become productive citizen once she's released. In my opinion, she does not suffer from any kind of severe personality disorder that might lead to dangerousness. And she is not at all violence prone or dangerous from all the measures we currently have at our disposal to evaluate and predict such things. So if she doesn't have a personality disorder, in Diane Downs' argument, then what led her to commit the crime? She's also saying that her diagnosis doesn't exist. Does he know that? Now, there's more reports in there. Miss Diane Downs was a participant in the Silver Bells Crochet Project from 4 local injured vets. This project entails volunteers from the senior inmate living quarters to crochet by hand various items to be used by the local vets in need. Participation in the project was completely voluntary and cultivated an enduring sense of community and camaraderie among the senior citizen inmates who reside in the senior inmate living quarters. The finished products also foster a sense of achievement and pride in personal ability for each individual who participated. Miss Downs completed several pieces, including lap blankets and hats and scarf sets. Miss Downs took her own initiatives to contribute her creativity and craftsmanship, and was a willing participant in the project. And that was signed by Dr. Rossi. There's more reports. This is from Dr. Shoji, I think that's how you say that. He says, I began counseling with, or she writes, I began counseling with Dr. A. Shoji a year before my 2010 parole consideration hearing. Okay, that was December 9th of 2010. The board acknowledged that they had my psych reports, but gave no credit to them. I wonder how it was appropriate to require prisoners to get counseling and then disregard that same counseling after it was achieved. Back in 2010, I had no way of knowing what was in my psych reports. It was only recently that that prisoners were permitted to get copies of all their medical and psych reports. After I received them, as I've said before, I was unimpressed by the absence of a diagnosis. Now I understand the term diagnosis denotes an illness. The fact that there's no diagnosis is reflective of the fact that I suffer from no personality disorder. Huh? Dr. Shoji counseled me every month for 2 years, and her reports reflect the following. I talk about my crime, therefore our sessions were meaningful. I talked about my children and how this crime has affected them. I talked about my aging parents and wanted to learn how to care for them. I was engaged in prosocial behaviors. My insight was good. I was sensitive to my family's feelings. Page after page of notes about my sessions, and never once did Dr. Shoji know one cause to believe I suffer from a personality disorder. Prison psychs don't just sit in a room and girl talk with prisoners. They rely as much on the prisoner records and correctional officers' observation of their patients. Had anyone in the prison seen anything resembling antisocial behavior in the 20 years I'd been in the California prison system, you can be certain there would have been a report that Dr. Shoji would have read and incorporated into her assessment of me. The board keeps saying they're denying me parole because no psych has diagnosed me as mentally healthy. That expectation is pie in the sky. It is an impossible diagnosis for anyone on the planet. All this board can hope to see is the absence of a diagnosis of a personality disorder, and that's what every psychiatrist and psychologist in California has rendered concerning me. Pursuant to ORS 144.228, the board shall parole me because I don't suffer from a severe personality disorder. That's reason enough to convene another parole consideration hearing or to discharge me by file pass. And there is more and more reports. For those that want to read it, I'll leave the link in the description box. Okay. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Is Diane Downs really ready to be paroled? Now, let me correct myself. She's eligible for a hearing, I think, in 2025. All right. That's really not that far from here. Okay. And if she's granted another hearing, do you guys think this woman is eligible? Do you guys think she's still a danger? What would the board need to see, or what would everybody need to see at this point? Do you think she understands that she committed this crime? What if she denies that she committed this crime? Like, should she even be released? Like, does she understand that she committed this crime? Because that's what she's guilty of, right? And I wonder what her children that are living would have to say about this. Do they feel like, where are they at, and how do they feel about the situation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you guys on the next one. There is somebody else that I want us to review by the name of Suzanne Smith. And let me tell you, I'm doing a deep dive on that one because she just recently made the headlines. And I'm talking about like last week recently. Okay? This lady is right up there with Diane Downs. Oh, and please hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe if you like this commentary. A lot of y'all in the comments were saying that you guys really liked being able to participate in the live chat. That's what we're doing. Let me know your thoughts and comments. I'll see you guys on the next one. Rabbits out.